not a plan to combine the two. What it is a study on what would happen if the U.S. Census Bureau decides, and believe me, they have the power, we do not, to actually dissolve the line between Kingsport urbanized area and Johnson City urbanized area. If that happened, very likely we could go over to a population of 200,000. So what does that mean? Census Bureau does its thing. Next thing, FHWA does its thing. Says, oh, you're a TMA. You've got other stuff to do. So, okay, why are you doing this? I mean, big deal. Become a TMA. Notice Chris Campbell here. Chris was here 10 years ago when this happened, or we faced this same situation. We kind of got caught blindsided by this. There is a Section 5307 funds. Kingsport and Johnson City Transit uses those for operating assistance. You become a TMA at that time. The caveat is that time. If you became a TMA or large urban over 200,000, all of a sudden you can't use those funds for operating. Now that's changed somewhat. There's a special rule, and Hannah will talk a little bit more about that. But I spent a half a day with Congressman Rose, Chief of Staff, not lobbying one way or the other, but I was asked, Glenn, what are the impacts? So I spent a half a day going over that, and then we began to realize, hey, we're looking strictly at transit. What are the other implications if you become a TMA? What do you have to do? And that led this drive. So right now, just so you know, there are 4 TMAs in Tennessee: Nashville, Knoxville, Chattanooga, and Memphis. Operate completely different than the small ones. So that's kind of the background and why we're doing this study. And I'm going to turn it over to Hannah, and then at the end we've got questions, discussion, and ask what you want. You know, this is really a fact-finding study, just so everybody has the facts out there, and then we're not faced in about 6 months from now, everybody panicking and say, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? What do we have to do? That's why we're doing this. And it was actually directed by the former mayor, Chief Rock, at the time, asking those very questions. So we're doing this study to find out. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Hannah Plummer from PCI, who had the contract to do this study for us.
Thanks, Tom. All right, can you hear me okay through the mic? If I speak loudly? Okay, good. All right, as Glenn said, my name is Hannah Plummer. I'm a transportation planner with KCI, and we were the consultants on this project. And I'm here to present on the background and findings of the Transportation Management Area Study. There's a lot of detailed information that I'll share with you, so feel free to stop me if you have a question that you think of while I'm speaking, but I'll also pause periodically throughout the presentation to see if anybody has anything they want to talk about. We've passed out draft copies of the executive summary, so those are on your table. And then there are a few copies of the full report. There's 5 of those over here. If you haven't had a chance to look at that, I would recommend that you take one if you'd like. But just a little bit of background on the study and why we did it. Glenn mentioned this a little bit, but Johnson City's urbanized area was delineated in 1982, which was after the 1980 census, when Johnson City passed the 50,000 person threshold, which allowed them to establish the Johnson City MTPO. And those UZA boundaries have evolved and shifted over time with the 1990, 2000, and 2010 censuses. And with the 2020 census, there's the possibility that a transportation management area, a TMA, could be designated in the region. So TMAs are generally designated by FHWA in urbanized areas with populations greater than 200,000 people. And they have different and additional planning and funding requirements than MPOs that are not TMAs. So we wanted to understand the context in which a TMA could be designated, what those different designation scenarios could look like, and who could be affected if that were to happen. We also wanted to outline the planning and regulatory and administrative changes that could accompany TMA designation, as well as changes to planning and roadway funding and transit funding. So currently, none of the MPOs in the region are TMAs. I'm going to try not to scroll all the way to the end. But if the urbanized area boundaries were enlarged or adjusted in such a way that affected more than one MPO, we wanted to understand what the consolidation options could be for the existing MPOs that would be within a single TMA. So we identified various ways that a TMA could be created in the region, and those are shown here. The boundaries between any two or more UZAs could be redrawn, which could result in a UZA with a population over 200,000 people. That could affect Johnson City and Kingsport, Johnson City and Bristol, or all three together. Any one of the UZAs by itself could also become a TMA on their own, though that's most likely to happen for Johnson City since it just has the largest population of the three UZAs. So if TMA designation occurred and the revised UZA boundary encompassed more than one MPO planning area, the executive boards of the affected MPOs could choose to consolidate or revise their formal planning agreements to meet these new TMA requirements that I'll describe in a minute. So they can choose to consolidate fully and become an entirely new MPO, or they could remain separate entities and have more than one MPO per UZA. If a TMA decided to remain separate MPOs, it requires approval from the governor, and it also requires a written formal planning agreement to address those planning responsibilities within the UZA. So I will pause there. Are there any questions about those designation scenarios before I talk about federal and state planning requirements? Yes.
In the lower box, you say that you could remain a single UZA with approval from the governor, so it takes an appeal to the governor to avoid a merged TMA. That with the federal government kind of default to a merged TMA, and if you want to do something different, you've got to go through this appeal process. Is that how it works?
So the TMA itself is a singular entity. Within the TMA, you have the choice to either become one MPO that covers the entire TMA, or you can have more than one MPO within that single TMA. So there's a decision-making point to make to decide if you want to consolidate or stay together. So it is sort of an appeal process with the governor, and then all of the affected MPOs have to agree as well. It's because you have that formal written agreement establishing what your responsibilities would be. Any other questions? Okay. So federal and state planning requirements. So the full report includes a lot more detail about this, but we reviewed federal and state statutes and regulations. Oh, yes?
I'm sorry, I did have one question.
No worries.
Because this is now going to be by state.
It could be. That's my understanding, yes. It would be both governors of both states if it was a bi-state MPO.
And just to be clear on that, they are responsible.
Right, because you already have a bi-state MPO, so you coordinate with them already. Yes? Yes, it is an automatic thing that happens when you reach that population threshold. Smaller MPOs can appeal to become a TMA, though that's less common because there's just more regulatory responsibilities that come along with being a TMA, so most MPOs don't elect to do that. But once you reach that 200,000 person threshold, it is what you become, is a TMA. Yes. Did I miss one? I did, thank you. Good catch. So federal and state planning requirements. So these regulations come from three sources: the United States Code, which is published by the U.S. House of Representatives, the Code of Federal Regulations, which is published in the Federal Register, and the Tennessee Code Annotated, which just codifies all the laws of the state of Tennessee. And then within those three sources, to go back to that next slide, we reviewed all the statutes and regulations that are related to TMAs and MPO planning responsibilities, and those are listed here, and I'll walk through each of these in turn. So the first one is 23 USC section 134, which covers metropolitan transportation planning. This one outlines the requirements for MPOs regarding designation and representation, work program requirements, and the second one, 49 USC section 5303, outlines the same policies but for public transportation. And so these regulations say that new TMAs are required to create a phase-in schedule that outlines how they'll meet TMA requirements no sooner than 1 year after they're designated. So there's a window in which they figure that all out, and then they have to create that schedule. And they also have to include a congestion management process, a CMP, in their transportation plan. And there's a few more requirements around the CMP that I'll talk through in a minute. The next one is 23 USC section 490, which includes information about policies related to national performance management measures. So things like data sources and calculations and safety, implementation, and reporting. And there's one element that applies only to TMAs, and that is based on air quality attainment status. So TMAs may be required to report on their congestion and emissions related performance measures for the whole UZA if they're out of attainment. So 23 CFR section 420. This one describes the FHWA regulations that apply to recipients of planning and research funds, including MPOs and TMAs. This applies to both. This one says that TMAs have to submit a full UPWP rather than a simplified statement of work, which is technically allowed for MPOs that are not serving TMAs, though in Tennessee, all MPOs submit a full UPWP regardless of their TMA status, but this CFR just formalizes that you have to do that when you're a TMA. And then within that UPWP, TMAs have to include detailed cost estimates of how they plan to use their funding for planning and research and development and technology transfers. So this one doesn't really change much about how MPOs typically operate, but it's just formalizing what most MPOs already do and what TMAs have to do. This one is long, so I have 2 slides for this one. This is section 450, Planning Assistance and Standards. It outlines the planning and programming requirements for TMAs and non-TMAs. TMAs have board composition requirements, and it states that to the extent possible, it's more ideal for one MPO to be designated per TMA, though, as I mentioned before, multiple MPOs can exist within a single UZA if the state approves it. If there's no substantial change to the MPO's voting representation or their planning responsibilities, TMA designation doesn't necessarily warrant MPO redesignation. So you don't automatically have to go through that redesignation process if you become a TMA, unless there are substantial changes. If a TMA is sharing planning responsibilities with a non-TMA, or if the TMA is serving multiple MPOs within a single UZA, this is where you get that requirement to have to create a formal written agreement to outline your planning responsibilities. Going back to the CMP, that congestion management process has to be reflected in both the MTP and the TIP, and it has to be established within 18 months of designation. And then every 4 years, FHWA and FTA conduct their formal certification reviews of TMAs to make sure they're meeting all of their planning requirements. Non-TMAs, they self-certify that they're meeting those requirements. So this is the last one for this section, Tennessee Code Annotated Section 64-8. This one we included because it affects Johnson City, MTPO, Knoxville, and Nashville, because MPO is defined in a different way in this code so that this requirement affects those MPOs, and it says that MPOs that have 3 or more counties that are fully within the state of Tennessee have to do this, and they have to have a voting member on the MPO's executive board that's chosen in consultation with the Tennessee County Highway Officials Association. So we included this one in the review because it does currently affect Johnson City. If the TMA became a bi-state TMA, bi-state MPO, this would no longer affect the TMA because of the way NPO is defined in this code. So are there any questions? Oh wait, I'm going to recap this. This is a lot of information. So TMA designation is likely to result in that revised UZA and MPA boundary. It may require restructuring executive boards and staff increases to meet those new TMA requirements and those administrative and planning needs. And then regarding the federal policies, there's core work products like the MTP and the TIP and the UPWP that would need to be updated to account for an enlarged planning area and include the congestion management process. And then those, again, the federal certification reviews would happen every 4 years. And those larger planning geographies and populations in general likely would require increased coordination with stakeholders and agency partners to accomplish the kind of regional planning that you would need to do as a TMA. Okay, so any questions on federal and state planning requirements? The next section is planning and funding for roadways. Awesome. Okay, so we summarized the potential changes that TMA designation could have on planning funds, PL funds, SDBG funds, and transportation alternatives funds. And I'll just describe those funding buckets briefly and then talk through the changes that would accompany TMA designation. So planning funds support metropolitan transportation planning activities, and those would continue to be suballocated through TDOT's consolidated grant program regardless of TMA status. So no change there. For SDBG funds, which support a wide variety of project types, locally selected projects would be apportioned directly to the TMA by Congress. So that's a change. And state-selected projects would continue to be apportioned through TDOT's competitive grant program. Or through TDOT. TA funds would continue to be awarded through the competitive grant fund. And the set suballocation for TA funds would continue to be provided to urbanized areas based on population. So that would remain and likely increase if population increased. So in general, since these funds are partially awarded based on population, if population increased, funding would increase for a future TMA. SDBG funds would be allocated directly to the TMA by Congress for those locally selected projects, and TA funds would continue to be suballocated through TDOT as they currently are. The TMA would need to develop a process to select and prioritize SDBG and TA projects. And in general, these funds would require larger local match percentages if the overall amount increased, and potentially more administrative and reporting burdens for the TMA if they have more projects and more funds being issued to them. So that's planning and roadway funding changes. Any questions on that? The next section is transit. Yes?
TMA from the state legislature of reviewing the
Does it currently, is it allocated separately in your current situation from Virginia DOT and from Tennessee DOT? Okay. Yeah. To be honest, I'm not sure exactly what would happen with that. I don't know if you do, Glenn or Mary. If it's a special situation like that that was reached through an agreement with the DOTs in question, my guess is something similar could be established, but I'm not 100% sure. Moving on to transit funding. So these are the transit funding types that we reviewed in the report. And I'll talk in detail about the FTA ones. At the state level, the funding sources that we reviewed are those last three. They are competitive or have budgets that are awarded annually by the legislature. So we weren't able to estimate changes to potential future award amounts based on TMA designation, just because of the nature of that funding. So I won't speculate on those, but I'll talk through all of the FTA ones. So 5303 funds, they support MPOs in their public transportation planning activities in general. It's jointly administered by FTA and FHWA. Since 2017, TDOT has distributed those funds along with planning funds as part of their consolidated planning grant. 5307 funds, they support administration and planning and capital expenses for public transportation. This is the one that Glenn was mentioning had the special rule. So generally, operating expenses for TMAs are ineligible to be paid for with 5307 funds. But there's an exemption that FTA offers to service providers with fewer than 100 buses in their fixed route peak hour service. So in that case, they can spend up to 75% of this type of money for operating expenses, and that's the special rule. So that would continue if TMA were established. So these, in TMAs, they get these funds apportioned to a designated recipient, and in non-TMAs, they are suballocated by formula through TDOT's multimodal division. And I'll talk more about how the designated recipient point will affect a TMA. But 5310 funds, these provide funds to expand mobility options for seniors and individuals with disabilities. TMAs receive a direct apportionment, which again would require the TMA to establish a designated recipient to receive them. Non-TMAs receive these funds directly from TDOT. 5311, they provide capital planning and operating assistance for transit in rural areas. These go to NetTrans in the Johnson City region, and they're apportioned by TDOT through a formula based on population and ridership and revenue miles. 5339 funds support capital projects to replace transit vehicles and other equipment that has reached the end of its useful life. And TMAs receive a direct allocation of these funds from FTA, which is the third one that would require a designated recipient to receive those funds. And the FTA formula is based on population. Non-TMAs apply for these funds through a competitive grant program. So the effect of a TMA designation on these funding types is 5303, 5307, and 5339 funds are allocated through formulas that take into account population. And so any population increase would likely result in a relative increase of transit funding, though not so much that you would likely see a large expansion in transit service. For 5311 funds, because they're tied to rural population, if the UZA boundary increases, the rural areas would likely decrease, which could result in less funding for rural transit providers. For FTA funds that are apportioned directly to a designated recipient, then they suballocate those funds to the transit providers. That designated recipient would need to be selected from the current recipients or the MPO. And because there are multiple transit service providers in the region, and there could be more in the future, that designated recipient would need to develop a process by which they suballocate those funds to the multiple transit providers, and they need to do that in a way that all of the providers can agree that those funds are fair. That process can be complicated and fraught, and we've included a technical memo as an appendix to the full report that outlines how, as an example, how 5307 funds are apportioned by the designated recipients in Knoxville and Nashville. And we've included some examples of other areas, other TMAs that have multiple service providers within their region. And so there's different ways that you can do that, but that's one takeaway for the transit funding. So let's see. Any questions about this before we move on to just general summary? Yes. Ooh. Is it? Okay. Yeah. and WeGo is, and we've got examples of the MOUs that each of those providers, each of those designated recipients sends to FTA explaining their apportionment process. It's in the final report. You can establish a formula, you can do sort of handshake agreements, and it's all documented in that, what they call a FTA split letter. So that's how that works. Yes. I'm going to point to Glenn or Mary. Do you know?
It's my understanding that each individual agency, that is something good to check on. Chris, you know,
I haven't heard, I was assuming the agency,
that's what I was thinking.
Per agency? Okay.
that's how an officer does theirs.
Okay.
It comes in, that person sits down with all the agencies, and the executive will go on how it's like.
No, specifically on specialty.
I think they break that down by
Because it's up to 75% of that agency's apportionment, not the full pot that is then split up to the individual agencies.
And the other question that Bill had, I believe the only agency, the only TMA in the state is Nashville, they're under the
Okay. Any other questions? Yes. If the UZA was redrawn to include, for example, Kingsport and Johnson City, then that new UZA would have a larger population than each one has right now. So that's what we mean by increase in population. If one UZA happened to grow enough to become a TMA by themselves, it would just be within that single UZA.
It could be based on.
Yeah.
And the other thing to keep in mind, we do not know how the Census Bureau is going to define these things. They've changed the criteria from 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a different set of criteria. So, and the other thing to keep in the back of your mind is, you know, this is kind of statewide. It's not just us. It's going to be
And the census will be issuing that, or they'll be completing that redelineation in spring or summer of 2022. So just to summarize all of this at a really high level, because it's a lot of information, if I can scroll. There we go. So this slide shows all of the impacts of TMA designation that don't require a decision. They just come with the process of becoming a TMA if that were to happen. The planning geography could change. It could potentially become a bi-state TMA. There are changes to work products and requirements for new work products like the CMP. There would be changes to the planning and roadway and transit funding, including increased and decreased allocations depending on the funding type. Changes to match requirements and distribution processes. And then there's the requirements surrounding certification reviews every 4 years. So this is just something these are all things that will happen if a TMA designation occurs. Yes, sir?
You state that there will be increases in fields that need to be created with higher level matches. Is the higher level match a result of the proportionate split being, the ratio being higher than local, or is it a result of the fact that the ratios are the same, but just more money?
Correct. The second one.
Okay.
exactly, yeah. So if you just have larger amounts of money coming in, you still have to pay your 20% local match. That amount might be higher than you're currently paying now. Yeah, there'd be no changes to the split. So this next slide, though, shows decision-making points that would need to be decided. So if a TMA encompassed more than one MPO, this is that consolidation question, it would have to decide on whether or not to consolidate and become one larger MPO or remain separate entities. If there's no consolidation, the MPOs would have to update their planning agreements to establish their planning responsibilities within their relative or their respective planning areas. And then in general, staff increases could be considered to meet those additional work requirements, increase workloads. For STBG and TA funds, the TMAs would need to establish processes for selecting and prioritizing projects, as I mentioned before. And then for FTA funds, the TMA would need to designate their designated recipient and develop what that suballocation process looks like for 5307, 5310, and 5339 funding types. So that's what's included in the report at a very high level. The Census Bureau, as I mentioned before, will be releasing those updated delineations in the spring or summer of 2022. So if any of the UZAs in the Johnson City area would be designated as a TMA, that's when that would happen. Even if that doesn't happen this time around, this kind of advanced planning, I think, is helpful to allow the MPOs in this area to just think through what this process could look like at some point in the future, and know what kinds of impacts it could have on their operations and planning in general. So are there any other questions or general discussion? Yes. I think I saw you over there. My understanding is that, kind of almost don't want to say this because I don't want to be wrong, is that you would need to issue congestion-related measures and report those for the entire UZA.
And we just want to, right, you want for now, that is decided by EPA, not if it's just.
If you had multiple MPOs within a TMA, each MPO could still have their own executive boards. We've got examples in the report of how other MPOs, other TMAs across the country handle this. Sometimes they have fully separate MPOs with their own executive boards, and then something that they call like a leadership committee, where coordination at the high level happens there, and then that information is sort of distributed down to the staff level. But there's different ways that you could handle it. The formulas themselves would be the same for the planning and roadway funding categories. It's when you get into the FTA funds where you have to create a designated recipient and decide how to apportion money, where if you have multiple service providers in a UZA and you need to suballocate that, and you have more than one MPO at the table to make that decision, that coordination process may get more complicated. But you would have to go through a similar process if it was one MPO versus two. Lots of coordination, basically. I think that's correct. We may need to check on that, though.
We need to check on it.
Yeah.
EPA does not designate it by
Is it by county currently?
They have done it by county. And if you remember, years ago, a small section of Hawkins County was designated down with Johnson and Steve.
We will check on that for you though and just confirm.
UZAs don't generally enter into UZAs
Mm.
form. It's primarily by county.
Any other questions? Okay.
Now, and I would just like to end up and say thank you all. This information is on our website. Wendy has streamed this live, and if you want to go back and watch it, it's on the city's website, so you can watch it again. Also, as you think about this, if you've got questions, you know, like a special rule in Virginia or special situation, I think that can be worked out if that were to come down to it. But now's the time to be thinking about this, not 6 months from now from if or when this happens. You know, that was the whole point of this, was to make people prepared for this before things come up to the deadline.
Thank you.